Hello, my name is Julie Corden, and until December 2024, I served as a board member at the IAASB, and I also had the privilege of being the chair of the Fraud Task Force. This is the first video in our four-part video series introducing the IAASB's revisions to the International Standard on Auditing, which deals with the auditor's responsibilities relating to fraud in an audit of financial statements, otherwise known as ISA 240. In this video, I'll walk you through the key changes in the revised standard. I'll also highlight how these changes clarify the auditor's responsibilities related to fraud and the importance of exercising professional skepticism throughout the auditing process. One of the key drivers for this project were the corporate failures that had been happening around the world, which had brought the topic of fraud to the forefront, including questions from stakeholders about the role and responsibilities of auditors relating to fraud in an audit. In response, the IAASB began an extensive information gathering process in early 2020 to explore the issues and practical challenges auditors face in applying the previous version of ISA 240. As part of this effort, the IAASB published a discussion paper in September 2020 on fraud and going concern. This paper aimed to examine the gap between what the public expects from auditors regarding fraud and what the auditor is actually required to do under our standards. Based on the feedback received, the IAASB decided that it was in the public interest to revise ISA 240, and a project proposal was approved in December 2021 to begin that work. In undertaking the revision of ISA 240, the IAASB identified 4 project objectives, each rooted in serving the public interest and strengthening and clarifying the standard. First, we set out to clarify the auditor's role and responsibilities for fraud in an audit of financial statements. Clear responsibilities help ensure alignment between expectations and actual practice. Second, we aim to promote consistent behavior and facilitate effective responses to identified risks of material misstatement due to fraud. Third, we focused on reinforcing the importance throughout the audit of the appropriate exercise of professional skepticism while performing fraud-related audit procedures. And finally, we sought to enhance transparency on fraud-related procedures where appropriate, including strengthening communications with those charged with governance and strengthening the reporting requirements in ISA 240 and other relevant ISAs. As part of this project, the IAASB identified 7 key changes that directly respond to the key issues identified in the project proposal. These changes are designed to drive greater consistency in practice and lead to meaningful change in auditors' behavior. I'll walk you through these 7 changes now. First, ISA 240, or ISA 240 revised, clarifies and strengthens the auditor's responsibilities related to fraud. Changes set a clear and affirmative description of the auditor's responsibilities relating to fraud in an audit of financial statements. It also reduces the ambiguity about the auditor's responsibilities by decoupling the description of those responsibilities from descriptions of the inherent limitations of an audit. Second, the revisions reinforce the importance of exercising professional skepticism throughout the audit. The standard highlights the importance of remaining alert throughout the audit engagement for information that is indicative of fraud, and the importance of maintaining professional skepticism regardless of past experience or when efforts to conceal fraud could be manifested through pressure on the engagement team. I'll come back to the revisions to the auditor's responsibilities and professional skepticism later on in this video. Third, the section on risk identification and assessment was enhanced by applying a fraud lens on what is already required in ISA 315 revised 2019. The IAASB also restructured the risk assessment section of ISA 240 revised by aligning it closer to that structure in ISA 315 to demonstrate the integrated relationship between the two standards. The revisions introduced a fraud lens on the requirements already located in ISA 315, such as obtaining an understanding of key aspects of the entity's internal control, The changes to this section also focus the auditor on applying fraud risk factors and evaluating whether they give rise to wrongs due to fraud. Fourth, the standard strengthens the communication requirements with management and those charged with governance throughout the audit. Fraud-related matters are now framed as part of an ongoing dialogue that should occur throughout the audit process, not just at the beginning or at the end. The revised standard encourages robust two-way communication with active participation from all parties. Fifth, the revisions address what the auditor should do when fraud or suspected fraud is identified. The standard now calls for a pause and reassess moment, prompting the auditor to reflect on whether the audit approach needs to change in light of the understanding the auditor obtains about the fraud or suspected fraud. Sixth, enhancements were made to enhance transparency in the auditor report regarding fraud-related matters. The standard in its revisions requires that the auditor apply a fraud lens to the filtering mechanism used in ISA 701 when determining key audit matters related to fraud that need to be reported in the auditor's report. And seventh, the IAASB introduced new and enhanced documentation requirements that align better with the foundational standard that deals with audit documentation, ISA 230, as well as the documentation requirements in ISA 315 and other related standards. As mentioned earlier, one of the IAASB's key goals in revising ISA 240 was to clarify the auditor's role and responsibilities when it comes to fraud in an audit of financial statements. The revisions were meant to emphasize what the auditor can do in relation to fraud, rather than focusing on limitations. To support this, the standard introduces several structural and content enhancements. The auditor's responsibilities related to fraud are now presented earlier in the standard, coming before the descriptions of management's responsibilities and the responsibilities of those charged with governance as it pertains to fraud. Although the IAASB reaffirmed that the primary responsibility remains with management and those charged with governance, this relocation ensures that the auditor's role is clear and not overshadowed. In the previous version of the standard, the auditor's responsibilities were described in the same paragraph as the inherent limitations of an audit, which led to some confusion. The explanation of the auditor's role is now separated from the discussion on inherent limitations, making the responsibilities clear and more direct. Crucially, the IAASB introduced a statement that inherent limitations do not reduce the auditor's responsibility to obtain reasonable assurance that the financial statements as a whole are free from material misstatement due to fraud. The IAASB also sought to clarify the auditor's work effort related to identifying, assessing, and responding to risk of material misstatement due to third-party fraud. Let's now look at how the revised standard reinforces the importance of professional skepticism in addressing fraud risks throughout the audit. The revised standard includes key concepts in the introductory paragraphs that emphasize the importance of exercising professional skepticism and professional judgment in accordance with ISA 200 when planning and performing an audit. The IAASB also added a new requirement which requires the auditor to remain alert for additional fraud risk factors. This is particularly important because experience indicates that fraud risk factors are often present when a fraud is found to occur. In addition, references to past experience of the auditor relating to honesty and integrity of management and those sorts of governance were removed, encouraging auditors to approach each engagement with a fresh pair of eyes. The IAASB also introduced a stand-back requirement to emphasize the importance of the auditor pausing near the end of the audit to consider all the evidence obtained and whether any other work is necessary to support sufficiency of the auditor's assessed risks and responses to assessed risks. The effective date of ISA 240 revised is set for periods beginning on or after December 15, 2026. This timeline was considered reasonable for translation, national adoption, and implementation activities. Importantly, this date aligns with other major IAASB projects, namely the going concern and listed entity PI Track 2 revisions, to avoid repeated changes to the auditor's report in consecutive periods. Visit the Fraud Project page to access the revised standard and all the materials published to help with adoption and implementation of the standard, which includes the basis for conclusions and a fact sheet. I invite you to watch our other videos focusing on the revisions made to the risk identification and assessment section, the work effort when fraud or suspected fraud has been identified, and transparency of the auditor's report. Thank you very much for listening.